What's the best way to make amends with a friendly nation after you accidentally scrapped some helicopters they really wanted for their war effort? If you're Australia, the answer is simple. Send in the tanks. But why tanks and why now? The tank war in Ukraine has been brutal, and Russia's losing ground so fast. As of October 2024, Russia has lost a staggering 9,071 tanks, with 2,431 of them destroyed. These high destruction rates are bleeding Russia's resources dry. And while Ukraine has also lost tanks, the difference lies in quality. Russia is now pulling ancient tanks like the T-62 and T-54-55 out of retirement to keep up, while Ukraine's Western tanks continue to hold their ground. Ukraine's forces have Western-built tanks like the Leopards and Abrams that are not only tougher, but also designed to protect crews and deal devastating blows to the enemy. This advantage could be decisive if they get more Western support. And now Australia is stepping in. What exactly are they offering, and could this be a game changer? Let's dive in. Australia has been a consistent backer of Ukraine. It's the second largest provider of aid to Ukraine from the Indo-Pacific region after Japan, with over $1.5 billion in total since the war began. However, unlike Japan, Australia's aid has mostly been military in nature, rather than financial or humanitarian. Australia has given a broad array of offensive weapons to Ukraine, including the so-called cardboard drones made from Spypack Corvo, crucial 155mm artillery shells in partnership with France, 6 M777 towed artillery pieces to fire those shells, 105mm artillery shells, armored personnel carriers, and 120 mine-resistant Bushmaster infantry support vehicles. Now you can add 49 more M1A1 Abrams tanks to the list. Australia has been a user of the Abrams since 2006, when it acquired 59 M1A1 versions of the tank from the United States. The acquisition replaced the older Leopard 1 tanks it had used in its armed forces since the middle of the 70s. The Abrams tanks featured a mixture of equipment used by the US Army and Marine Corps. The M1A1 Abrams first appeared in the mid-1980s, and production continued until 1992. It boasted several upgrades over the first version of the Abrams. These included a 120mm gun that replaced the 105mm gun the tank originally used, and better defensive features. The Abrams integrated management system was also added as the tank continued to get upgrades. This upgrade took older units and reconditioned them by adding forward-looking infrared and far target locating sensors to aid in its target acquisition. The secondary 50 caliber machine gun got its own thermal sight. Better communications equipment such as a tank infantry phone and Blue Force tracking were also added. Depleted uranium armor components were used to strengthen the tank's defenses further, but the Australian M1A1s lacked this particular feature. The M1A1 Abrams quickly proved itself as a superior tank in the Gulf War, where it easily defeated the T-72 and T-80 tanks it encountered. The Abrams had longer range, a faster rate of fire thanks to the manned gunner rather than the slower autoloader of these Soviet-type tanks, and better situational awareness. These factors meant it often got the first shot against enemy armor, a critical advantage. The results told in the numbers. It's estimated that over 3,300 Iraqi tanks were destroyed in the Gulf War. In contrast, the American-led coalition forces lost just 31 tanks. At the famous Battle of 73 Easting, only 14 American Abrams tanks crushed a force of over 50 Iraqi tanks. The Iraqi T-72 tanks were hit by armor-piercing anti-tank rounds before they were even aware of what was happening. The American force only suffered minor casualties. But the Battle of 73 Easting was just the opening act in what would become one of the largest tank confrontations of the 20th century. There was rain that night, which turned the sand to mud. The retreating Iraqis had also set fire to nearby oil fields, adding to the darkness. Then there were flashes of tank guns in the smoke. This was the beginning of what is officially known as the Battle of Norfolk, better known among Gulf War veterans as Fright Night. Unfortunately for the Iraqis, the M1A1 Abrams was good at night fighting thanks to its new thermal imaging technology. Despite the unfavorable conditions, coalition forces again routed the Iraqi tanks, destroying nearly 600 while losing only a few. Most of the Allied casualties, 6 dead and 32 wounded, came as a result of mistaken friendly fire due to the chaotic environment. In 100 hours, ground operations in the Gulf War came to an end with complete victory for the coalition. That's what well-trained tank crews using superior tanks can help to do. The M1A1 Abrams has proven itself under fire in very difficult conditions. The tank is just as capable today, even if it isn't the top-of-the-line model anymore. So why has Australia chosen to donate such seemingly valuable pieces of equipment? After all, one of the reasons why Western countries have proven hesitant in providing more aid is a worry about the depletion of domestic stockpiles. Ordinarily, you might think that Australia can more easily afford to dispense with tanks than most NATO countries can. Unlike Poland, which is understandably investing in 116 Abrams tanks, Australia is an island nation. Poland must create a large land army to defend itself against its increasingly aggressive historical adversary, Russia. In contrast, Australia's primary threat is from an expansionist China. As a result, Australia, like its American ally, is moving away from prioritizing the war on terror and shifting toward great power competition. For Australia, a confrontation with China would entail hostilities primarily taking place in the seas and skies of the first island chain. Australia therefore needs to build or acquire ships, submarines, aircraft, and missiles first and foremost. Tanks would seem to be less important in such a security strategy. However, that assessment would be wrong. Australia never intended to get out of the tank business. On the contrary, tanks could prove vital in quickly covering strategic ground on these small islands and defending them from landings, just as they had in World War II. Although land operations against China would be comparatively limited, Australia is still upgrading and replacing its tanks. In April 2021, Canberra requested the purchase of 160 M1A1 tank hulls in order to build 75 of the newer M1A2 SEP version 3 tanks, along with other types of vehicles. In January 2022, Australia decided to buy 75 M1A2 tanks from the United States in a deal worth $3.5 billion. This was a purchase order more than adequate to replace the earlier fleet of M1A1 tanks. That left the question of what Australia should do with its older models that were reaching the end of their service life. Ukraine has long desired these tanks. It first requested a batch of 14 of them in May 2023. However, like many other cases in this war, the request took a long time before being granted. Australia hesitated because of the perceived high logistical costs to transport these tanks. Abrams tanks are not easy to transport because of their weight. They could also not be shipped to Ukraine directly, but had to come by way of the United States. In February 2024, Canberra insisted that delivering the retiring M1A1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine was not on the table because of these challenges. Later in the year, Australia further set back relations with Ukraine by burying helicopters that it had sent a formal request for. These were helicopters of the MRH-90 Taipan fleet. The Taipan entered service in 2007 and was retired from the Australian Armed Forces between 2022 and 2023. The Taipan is a medium-lift, multi-role helicopter with 20 troop seats and room for up to 12 stretchers. It can be used for missions ranging from troop transport, search and rescue, medical evacuations, and the insertion of special operations forces. It was designed to carry out missions in rough weather conditions. The Australian Army and Navy both used it. The Taipan supposedly had built-in safety features. However, these features did not prevent the Taipan from being troubled in recent years. In March 2023, one of the helicopters was forced into an emergency landing. All crew members were safe and the helicopter was recovered. Unfortunately, that was not the case 4 months later, when a Taipan crashed into the sea during an exercise. It and all 4 of its crew members were lost. In January, the Australian government retired the aircraft. All 47 helicopters were scrapped and sold for parts, rather than being donated to Ukraine as requested. The mainframes that could not be broken down were buried. Perhaps Canberra thought the Taipan fleet would bring more harm than good to the Ukrainian cause. Nevertheless, the move was not only controversial internationally, but among the Australian public. They might not have had the same safety issues, but given Canberra's hesitance to send them, many Australian policymakers worried that the so-called mothballed M1A1 Abrams tanks would suffer the same fate. Simon Birmingham, the leader of the opposition in the Australian Senate and Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, took the opportunity to levy harsh criticism at the government's move and issue a warning. Labour's decision to bury rather than gift the retiring Taipan helicopters baffled many and must not be repeated with the Abrams tanks. The government of Anthony Albanese seemed to have gotten the message. In August, Defence Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles said that the government was exploring a range of possibilities of new military aid with the Ukrainian government. Other sources in the government confirmed that these discussions centred on how the Australian government could get the tanks to Ukraine. In September, the diplomatic dance to donate the tanks began in earnest. At that point, Canberra had decided to make the donation. However, it could not make such a donation on its own. It needed permission from the United States, the origin country of the tanks. Since Ukraine was a third country, the United States as the point of origin could refuse such a transfer under its international traffic in arms regulations. Fortunately for Ukraine, the United States has already donated the same M1A1 Abrams tanks, so it would have looked baffling for Washington to refuse such an offer now. It didn't take long for the United States to give the Australians the go-ahead to donate the tanks. On October 16th, Canberra announced that it would be sending at least 49 of the M1A1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine in a deal worth $245 million. The move coincided with the NATO defense ministers' meeting in Brussels, which Australia's defense industry minister, Pat Conroy, was attending. He later met with his Ukrainian counterpart on the margins to give him the details. Although these older Abrams were supposedly mothballed, they were still in good condition. Retired Lieutenant Peter Lee, who served as Australia's Chief of the Army between 2002 and 2008, and therefore oversaw the introduction of these tanks into service, said in September, "Although we are retiring them, they are a very competent tank. They should be well maintained, there are spare parts available, and the Ukrainians are very keen to get them. We should put them on a ship and get them over there. I certainly wouldn't want to see the bloody things destroyed or buried." J.C. Dodson, a defense consultant in Ukraine who assisted with the initial negotiations to donate the Abrams, was optimistic that the tanks would arrive in short order, also touting their being in good condition. The Ukrainians, already having M1A1 Abrams tanks in the field, suggested to him both a good logistics chain and pre-existing training. The move allows Ukraine soldiers to breathe a hearty sigh of relief. The United States only sent 31 M1A1 Abrams tanks last year and has not sent any more, despite having thousands of them in storage. As noted, Ukraine has seen the destruction of at least 8 of these tanks. On October 7th, David Axe, in an article for Forbes, estimated that Ukraine likely only had a maximum of 25 Abrams tanks left. Although each Abrams tank is worth more than one of its Russian opponents, the attritional math still favors Russia. That was why Australia's decision to donate most, if not eventually all, of its older Abrams slated for retirement meant so much to the Ukrainian cause. The tanks could get better too. Australia might have originally slated these tanks for mothballing, but the Ukrainians will probably find a way to modernize them anyway. Ukraine has shown that the M1A1 of the 2000s vintage can still be adapted to changing realities. The war has revealed much about the new demands that modern technology will put on armies in general and tanks in particular, particularly with drones and counter-drone technologies. Drones have been more commonly responsible for tank destruction in Ukraine than other tanks have. Unlike the Battle of Norfolk in the Gulf War, direct tank combat has been rare in Ukraine. Small Ukrainian drones in particular have been among the most lethal tank-killing weapons in this war. Russia has been slow to adapt to these demands. Early in the year, Ukraine started to find T-72s that looked to be equipped with drone jammers. Once captured, they found that these jammers were unlikely to work because of their poor positioning on the tank and bad construction. But Ukraine saw the attempt as important and understood that it needed to adapt its tanks to counter Russian drones too. The Abrams tanks in Ukraine are operated by the country's elite 47th Mechanized Brigade. This unit has been in combat for over 15 months straight and was recently rotated off the front line for a well-deserved period of rest, but that didn't mean the work stopped. The brigade's sole Abrams battalion used the opportunity to adapt its surviving tanks for the demands they'd seen at the front. In January 2024, the brigade posted a curious video. The video featured an M1A1 Abrams tank with the typical explosive reactive armor ERA on its sides. However, in modern armored warfare, the turret is much more vulnerable thanks to drones and smarter anti-tank missiles. So the turret of this Abrams tank showed off its new fashion of wearing ERA manufactured in Ukraine. There was also another accessory, cage armor. The infamous Cope cage maybe. Not entirely, because this armor featured anti-drone jammers attached to the cage. The ERA on the turret is designed to defend against incoming warheads such as RPGs or more sophisticated anti-tank guided missiles like Russia's 9M133 Kornet. Boasting a 10-pound warhead, this weapon is designed to defeat armored vehicles with explosive reactive armor and can supposedly penetrate 1,000 millimeters of armor, even behind ERA. The Kornet is responsible for the destruction of several Western tanks in Ukraine, including the first loss of a British Challenger 2 tank outside of Robotyne in Zaporizhia. In September 2023, when a Kornet hit one of Ukraine's Swedish-made Leopard 2 variant called the Stridsvagn 122, the impact destroyed the tank's ammunition rack, but because of its design to protect the crew members, all of them survived their vehicle's destruction. Ukraine's upgraded M1A1 Abrams tanks have ERA on their turrets to give them a better chance of surviving the rigors of a modern battlefield. Meanwhile, the drone jammers are designed to interfere with the electronic signals connecting enemy drones with their human operators. If successful, the drones will need to return to their operators or be forced to the ground. Although experienced drone operators know how to set the drone's target as its designated home base, this is not an easy thing to do with a moving item like a tank. The incoming M1A1 Abrams tanks will probably have these features installed from the start. If all works as intended, these tanks will be more survivable than the first batch the Ukrainians got from the United States last year. When the deal to send the Australian Abrams tanks to Ukraine was finalized, Conroy indicated he was eager to move on from the earlier controversy about the buried helicopters. Ukraine getting more valuable tanks is likely a good way to bury the hatchet instead. Ukraine's ambassador to Australia, Vasyl Miroshnichenko, was full of praise for the move, calling the new tanks a substantial piece of aid. He singled out the M1A1's armor and missiles, saying that those features would be of large help to Ukrainian forces on the defensive lines. However, while Ukraine remains on the defensive in its internationally recognized territory, the brass in Kyiv undoubtedly wants to do much more with the Abrams tanks. The M1A1's success in the Gulf War is on the Ukrainians' mind. They know that Russia is still using the same tanks that proved so inadequate against the Abrams over 3 decades ago. However, Ukraine needs more of these tanks in its arsenal to create such offensive power. With thousands in storage in the United States, the Ukrainians were probably hoping for more than just Australia's tanks. They wanted to open the door to many more coming from the United States. Ukrainian officials claimed that the deal with Canberra was a simple ask for military equipment that the Australians were set to replace anyway. That message carries just as much meaning for the United States. Undoubtedly, Kyiv is hoping that Washington will decide to be as generous with its older tank arsenal as Canberra finally decided to be. Increasing the percentage of Western tanks in its overall tank fleet is critical for Ukraine to begin to see more lopsided results in its war of attrition against Russia. For all its problems, Russia is getting tanks to the battlefield at a high enough rate to offset its losses in comparison to Ukraine's similar Cold War-era tanks. The only way to be sure of victory in this game is to inflict disproportionate losses, which the M1A1 Abrams has more than proven itself capable of doing. Setting the wheels in motion for broader progress in this area and inducing further tank donations from the United States might be the biggest contribution the Australian donation might wind up making. The comparative ease with which the United States agreed to the transfer of the Australian tanks probably sent hope to the Ukrainians. What impact will Australia's decision to give most of its M1A1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine have on the ground against Russia and on the diplomatic front? Might the move encourage the United States to send more tanks too? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.